Hey, good morning, everybody watching this on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, watching it live with us, or maybe you're listening to this on the Successes of Choice podcast network. I'm your co-host, Jamy Bechler, and this is the Talent and Strategy Show made possible by our friends over at Affinity Recruiting and Consulting. Check out everything that they're doing at affinitytoday.com. And as usual, my old friend, Ruston Pierce, joining us, President of Consulting for Affinity. Ruston, good morning to you.
Good morning.
How you doing, Ruston? You doing all right?
Oh, yeah, doing great.
Awesome. And our very special guest today is Fred Diamond. Fred Diamond is the founder of the Institute for Excellence in Sales. He's the host of the Sales Game Changers podcast, which I was fortunate enough to be on a few years ago. I guess he was scraping the bottom of the barrel, had to fill in a spot or something. But Fred, welcome to the show.
Jamy and Ruston, I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm very excited about what we're going to be talking about.
Yeah, well, you do a lot, and your podcast is a big deal. You get tons of engagement. You have a great audience, great insights, and also you've been a DJ. You've written books. Give us kind of a 30,000-foot view of, I just threw a couple labels out there, but kind of walk us through a little bit of your career path to what you're doing now.
Yeah, most of my career has been in technology, sales, and marketing. Worked at Apple Computer for about 7 years, Compaq Computer, did some international marketing at a company called CompuWare, not too far from you up in Detroit. Went to work for myself in 2002. Now it's called fractional, but back then it was called outsourced. So I was a outsourced chief marketing officer. Along the way, Microsoft became my best client, and they would assign me to various places. 2012 or so, I created the Institute for Excellence in Sales, mainly because even though I was an outsourced marketing officer, CMO, the companies were hiring me because they had sales challenges. So my target audience became VPs of sales who were struggling, typically in tech, B2B tech, who were struggling for a number of reasons. One of them was because the marketing just wasn't working. So we created the Institute for Excellence in Sales based out of Washington, D.C. We did programs for sales leaders. Eventually, we got to large companies as clients, members. We now call them partners. Along the way, I started a podcast, the Sales Game Changers podcast. We've had about 2 million interactions. I wasn't scraping the bottom of the barrel when I reached out to you. One of my fun groups of people to interview are performance coaches, particularly in sports and basketball. So I interviewed you, our mutual friend, the great Alan Stein Jr., and some other people along the way. We like to say that we're the center of excellence for corporate women in sales and corporate best practices, typically B2B. We're very fortunate to have, we call our customers now partners, companies like Amazon, Salesforce, Red Hat Software, Hilton, for example. And the podcast is doing great. Yes Where called us the top B2B sales podcast of 2022. And we're doing shows nonstop. And just to wrap up along the way, I have written 2 books. One is on sales performance called Insights for Sales Game Changers. Basically, some of the highlights of the first 450 episodes we did. We're up to over 620 now. And as people can guess, I also wrote a book on Lyme disease awareness called Love, Hope, Lyme, what family members, partners, and friends who love a chronic Lyme survivor need to know. I like to say I'm the first person in history to write a book on sales performance improvement and Lyme disease awareness, but they're both close to me for different reasons.
It's possible you may end up being the only person ever to write those 2 books. That's a pretty wide spectrum.
I'd be shocked. As a matter of fact, on the Sales Game Changers podcast, we typically interview 2 types of people. We typically interview sales leaders at companies, like a VP of sales at Amazon or Hilton. And then I also, like I mentioned before, I like to interview people like Jamy, who either have written books or doing really interesting things to motivate and sales leaders. When I decided to write the book on Lyme disease awareness, I found people who were very successful in sales and had successfully battled Lyme disease. So I like to say I'm the first person to bring together the congruence on my podcast of sales performance and Lyme disease awareness. And I agree with you, Ruston. No one else in the history of the planet is ever going to say that again besides me.
That's definitely a sentence I wasn't expecting to hear today. So your company is called the Institute for Excellence in Sales. I'm curious, from your perspective, what are the characteristics of a really good salesperson, and how would you define excellence from a sales perspective?
Yeah. So once again, our focus is B2B, business to business. And I was doing an interview. We numbers wise, we're going to be publishing our 600th Sales Game Changers podcast episode in a couple of weeks. Even though we've actually done over 620, we had some funky namings, special episodes, those kinds of things. But the guy I interviewed, his name is Mark LaFleur. He was on episode number 2. And I actually interviewed him and the guy who was episode number 1. But Mark said the great salespeople today are the value proposition. The sales professional is speaking the value prop to the customer. One thing, Ruston, that I see with great sales professionals right now, and it's been this way for a long time, is they're deeply embedded in their customer's industry, right? And especially right now, when customers can get information on the internet, from social networks, et cetera, the role of the sales professional isn't to educate them from 0 to 100. It's really to get them to understand things they can do with technology, other things that they've seen with other types of solutions. So the value prop needs to know what's going on in the customer. They need to know what's going on in the industry. And it's gotten even more challenging over the last 3 years because everybody has been affected by the results of the last 3 years. But it used to be me interfacing as the sales professional with my customer. Here's the value prop. Now the bigger challenge is the customer's customer and the customer's customer's customer are all affected because of the results of the last 3 years. So the great salespeople are looking at that complete supply chain.
Well, you have a very exciting event starting today on March 3rd. You have the Women in Sales Leadership Forum starting today. Is that event kind of in line with the old school book, Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus? There's differences of women's in sales, or is this rather just a platform or an event to bring women together, kind of to congregate, to learn together about different things about sales?
That's a great question. And a big part of what we do, and one of the main reasons why the companies like Salesforce and Amazon become partners of the Institute, is to better serve not just their women in sales, but their diverse audiences as well. I'll tell you the story of how that happened. It was 2014. Again, I mentioned in the DC area, there's a guy who runs a company. At the time, he was about $1 billion company. Now he's well over $8 billion. He met me in 2014. He said he wants to talk to me about something. He heard about the Institute, that I had created this. And he said, here's what I see. He said, I have 100 salespeople. He said, 50 of them are men, 50 of them are women. Now this particular guy has over 1,000 salespeople. He said, the women perform 6 to 8% better than the men. Their quota achievement is 6 to 8% better than the men. He said, the problem that confounds him is when he brings the teams together or subsets for any type of meetings, the men just overtake the meetings and the women shut down. He says, for example, all right, team, what should we do to build our presence at account A, whatever it might be? The guys just start shooting in, hey boss, here's 3 things we could do. Boom, boom, boom. Meanwhile, the women are sitting there. Okay, what's the problem? Next thing they know, the meeting is over and the guys have dominated the meeting, but the women may have had the better ideas. And he said that confounds them. It's like 8th grade science class. And that's a real thing. And for example, one thing, so we started really focusing on women in sales. Took us some time to understand what the best way for us to do it was. But an example might be something like if someone posts a job looking for an account executive, and here's 10 things. If a woman doesn't have all 10 of those features, she's not going to apply. A guy may have 2 and he's going to apply and he'll wing it. You know what I'm saying? He'll try to figure it out on the way. And it happens all the time. I'll tell you another thing why we do this program. That was one of the main reasons why. And then other people said to us, I'm looking for mentorship. I'm looking for coaching. I'm looking for support. When we launched the program, there were some women who were like, you know what? You're not a woman in sales. You're a sales professional. You got to figure it out. You got to tough it out. You got to be in a man's world type of a thing. And then when they started coming to our programs, they saw the value of the trusted and supportive networks. and they said, I need to be part of this. I looked at it the wrong way. And it's some women treat it as, how do I be in a man's world, as compared to how do I optimize my skills, the way I view things, the way I want to be asking people questions, et cetera. It's been one of the most satisfying things that I've ever done in my career. And I have an amazing partner. Her name is Gina Stracuzzi. She runs this program, and we've had women around the world who've participated.
What you just said, I literally witness all the time. I co-own a recruiting and consulting firm, and I can't tell you how many times I've reached out to a woman about a job, and I've sent her the job description. She's read it, and her first response is, I don't think I can do this because I only do about half these things. And I'm like, well, I reached out to you because actually you're the best candidate I've found, and I think you actually are hands down the best fit for this job. And oh yeah, there were 3 other people we've already talked to about this, and none of them were as strong as you. But she has already decided in her mind that this job isn't going to be a good fit because it wasn't an exactly perfect job description.
No, I'm glad you see that. I mean, I've heard that time and time again. I'll give you another example. Women and this of course isn't for it doesn't happen to everyone, but one of the things is that the women were telling us in this forum, and the leadership forum, it's a 6-session program. We were doing it in person in the DC area prior to 2020. We then did it virtual, 6 sessions over 3 months on leadership development, presence, high-level networking, things like that, leadership skills. And we then did it virtually. Excuse me. We've had women around the world who've participated. We're now doing it hybrid. We have a base in the Northern Virginia area, and half the women are virtual. They're around the world, and half the women are local. One of the things was they were complaining they were stating that one of their challenges was they weren't being recognized for promotions when other people around them were being promoted. And one thing that we've discovered is a lot of men will let it be known what their career aspirations are. I want to be a VP of the East Coast in 3 years, boss. At the performance review, that's what he'll say. A lot of the women were just kind of waiting, waiting to be recognized. They might be doing better, but they were like waiting to be recognized. And they've learned through our leadership forum that, you got to tell people what your aspirations are, because people don't know, and they don't know where you want to go. They don't know what you want to do. You have to let it be known, boss, in 2 years, I want to be a director, or whatever it might be. And those are things that the women have shared with each other. And some were like, I didn't know that I had the right to say what I want to do career-wise. And I didn't know that I had the right to speak up in meetings. And I didn't know that I had the right when someone asked me to get coffee, that I'm a peer of yours. I don't mind getting you coffee. I'm getting some for myself, but I'm not a secretary. I'm not an admin. I'm an account executive. I shouldn't be the one getting you coffee. That type, little things that, we have 3 guys here on the show, little things that we just either don't know, we just take for granted, we presume is okay. A lot of cases, it's not.
So there's been a lot of books over the years written about sales. Some say that sales is an art form. Some say that sales is science. Some say it's a happy blend of both. You are in a unique perspective because you've got the Institute. You see this through the lens of just teaching people how to do sales well, but you've also got the Sales Leadership Forum for women. So I'm curious, when you think about, is it science? Is it art? Is it a blend of both? Number one, what is your answer to that? What have you seen? Number 2, is it different for men versus women?
That's a great question. We like to say, the art and science of sales. Sales has gotten so much more of a science because data is so important. Like I mentioned before, the charismatic sales guy barging into the room, taking over, that just doesn't work anymore, for the main reason that the customer is in charge. The customer can get the information that they need from the internet, from social networks, et cetera. So the sales professionals now are the ones who are truly using data to bring answers to the customer. To challenge is a term that's come up. There was a book called The Challenger Sale that we're still a big believer in. And the way you're successful as a challenger is by understanding where the market's going and understanding what your customers' customers are dealing with. There was a book that came out a couple of years ago called The Introvert's Edge by a guy named Matthew Pollard, which said that introverts can be more successful than how we sometimes view extroverts. Now, you need to also have the confidence to ask questions. You also have to understand the sales process. Most B2B isn't one call when you get a sale. It may require 8 people. It might take 2, 3, 4, 5 years, right? So you have to make the investment in that, if you will. It also may be, back to the art, sometimes it might be the right question at the right time, but it's knowing what questions you should be asking at the right time. I think for women as well, it's very similar. You need to have a passion for sales too. I always like to say it's the hardest job. The place where I am, there's a dog. So my apologies if you hear the dog. That was supposed to be 3 years ago, but anyway, there's no babies walking around, so don't worry about that. Or cats. But anyway, you need to be a student of the sales process. You need to understand that. How do I deal with objections? What questions should I be asking? What's the role of the 8 people at the customer who are all important? It's a hard job, man, especially over the last couple of years when everything's changed.
Yeah.
Customer might have been looking for 3 years ago. Their business might be completely different, and what you're bringing to them may have had to shift. So the great salespeople they use science. I think it's more of a science now than ever. That's how I'm going to answer the question.
Well, you mentioned that you have over 600 podcast episodes. You've been churning them out. You've been having great guests. Are there some that stick out in your mind? Like either the guests were amazing, or there was a specific episode or a couple answers that really stood out to you. And then on top of that, do you have a bucket list? Do you have people that you would love to get on your podcast at some point?
Yeah. So you mean the best show besides yours?
Well, yeah, and you've already
That's what
crossed
he
off the
means.
bucket. Yeah, and plus you already crossed off the bucket list with me. So who else was in that bucket with me?
Yeah. So I'm always looking, my bucket list. It's funny. My mother always says you should get Mark Cuban on your show. And yeah, that would be nice. But to be honest with you, I'd rather have a VP of sales at IBM, because I started the podcast in 2017. I'll tell you why I started. Most of my career was in marketing. And even though I run something called the Institute for Excellence in Sales, when I decided to do it full time, to run the Institute, instead of getting 3 consulting clients a month, I had to get 10 companies to join the Institute. So it got much more transactional. And my pipeline had to have 30, 50 companies instead of 3 or 4. And it was August 2017. And I had 3 companies in my pipeline. And I said, that ain't going to work. I better rethink how I'm doing this. So I created the Sales Game Changers podcast, and I called or emailed VPs of sales around the DC Beltway. And I said, I'd like to have you VP of sales who has a company who should become a member. We called our customers members at the time. I had my trusty ATR 2100s. I had a Zoom H5 recorder. I had some nice light shield things that didn't do anything. And I was zipping around the DC Beltway interviewing people. And at the end of the day, 30% of the people that I've interviewed have become, we now call them partners of the Institute for Excellence in Sales. So every day, Jamie, I love to have guys like you, but I'm always looking for VPs of sales at B2B companies with at least 50 salespeople. And they're the ones that are going to make a difference. I originally thought I was going to be a 1 million download show like Joe Rogan. And then I talked to the guy at the time who had the #1 sales podcast. And I said, hey, I'm just kind of curious. How many downloads do you get per show? He said, on a good day, I get 200. And I was like, oh, all right. So I'm not going to be the next Joe Rogan. So how do I use the podcast to build the business? I'll give you 3 examples of shows that really stuck out with me besides yours. My favorite show of all time was my least downloaded show of all time. And when you do a podcast for your listeners, you want to get people to go to Apple and Spotify. I also do a lot of promotion on LinkedIn. That's one of my main ways, because B2B. So my daughter, when she was a junior in high school, was a competitive dancer, hip hop competitive team dance. So they had a competition in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee. So do you know what the #1 employer is in Pigeon Forge, Tennessee?
Dolly Parton.
There you go. Good job, Ruston. So like 2 weeks before, I went to LinkedIn and typed in Dollywood, and I came across the VP of sales. Her name was Cordelia Marzak. And I reached out to her. I said, you don't know me, but I do a podcast. Here's the link. I'm going to be in Pigeon Forge 2 weekends from now. I'd love to interview you. And she got her PR guy involved, and he said, yeah, sure, do it. So I met her. It was Sunday morning at 8:00, 2019 or 18. I think it was 2019. And we met in a conference room next door to Dolly's office in Dollywood. And I was a DJ, like you mentioned, at one point in my career. I'm sure I played 9 to 5 or Islands in the Stream or whatever. And I'm sitting there next to Dolly Parton's office, and Cordelia, a lovely lady, was telling me these great stories. And one story, she said, Dolly remembered everybody, and they were taking Dolly for some meetings with clients. And a star like Dolly, every second, every step is planned, right? They're walking down this hallway. Dolly made a quick right into a conference room, and there were 2 waitresses, let's just say, were there. And Dolly went up, knew their names, asked how their family was. And this is like a basic minimum wage type employee. And she said, I depend on you. And she knew their names, and she knew some things about their family. And it was such an amazing story. The little bit of the twist is it was the least downloaded show I've ever done, because Cordelia wasn't very active on LinkedIn. I think she may have had 200 connections. So even though I connected and tagged her, like nobody really saw it besides the people who got the downloads. And I've replayed that show like 3 or 4 times, when Dolly gave $1 million in COVID vaccinations, I believe it was, and when she was nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it was just, I've gone back, and it was such an amazing story. Can I share one other thing that stuck with me? The guy's name is Gary Milwit, and he's the VP of Leadership and Development at a company called JG Wentworth. And do you guys know what JG Wentworth does? So
Yes.
Ruston's nodding. He said they do like settlement. So if you win a lawsuit or a lottery, it's over 20 years, they'll pay you in cash. So, and you see their commercials at 3:00 in the morning. Gary's as a former football coach, high school football. Back to the art we were talking before, Ruston. He's kind of like that guy who not afraid of anything, but he also knows the process. He's a motivator. At the end of my shows, I say, give us one final action step, something specific people should listen to take their sales career to the next level. And Gary said, make everyone that you're talking to feel important. Everyone you're talking to feel important. And it was such a brilliant concept. When people call me, and Ruston, when people ask me, I'm going for an interview, do you think I would be, what should I say? And I'll say, you know what, just be prepared, but ask them questions, make them feel important, turn it around. You ask them questions. And I use that when people say, what is your bit of advice? I always use that one, and I attribute it to Gary as well.
Yeah. I was a school administrator for 23 years before I was doing this. And the people that I always gravitated to were the ones who interviewed me more than I did them. They stood out. So I'm curious, you've kind of name dropped a bunch of different companies. You mentioned Compaq, Apple, IBM. You've, because of just your network and your experience, you've been around a lot of really successful companies. IBM and Apple have done pretty well for themselves. I think we can all agree. So from your perspective, being around all these companies, the things that you've seen, are there characteristics or things about them that have been consistent that stood out to you? That's like, if I could name 3 things that every successful company does well, these are the things that I see in all of those companies.
Well, first off, sales is a respected profession at all of them. There's a book that came out. Her name is Lisa Earl McLeod, and the book is called Sales is a Noble Profession. And I've had her on the podcast. She's based down in Atlanta. Prior to the pandemic, we were bringing a lot of people to the DC area to speak. And it goes back to her whole premise is not just that sales is a noble profession, but the people who are successful in sales are successful because they view it that way. They view the fact that they're not like in transactional sales, they're in service. And I've even toyed with changing the name Institute for Excellence in Sales Service. But the reality is, we view sales as a profession, so we treat it as a profession. They also, these great companies, they really care about the customer. It's all about the customer. And a lot of them that are hugely successful have tremendous vertical solutions. They work with value-added partners who are bringing specific things. They have platforms designed to help their customers with specific things that they need to achieve in their marketplace. As a matter of fact, since we're based in DC, a lot of the leaders I've had on the show came from the public sector side. And all of these companies, they understand the market. Public sector is unique because there's contracts, tax dollars, budgeting cycles, et cetera, sometimes politics. So you really need to understand the nuance of the market. You need to understand how the customer, making it as easy as possible for customers to buy your things. But they also have people devoted to helping them achieve their goals, which is service to the citizens at the end of the day. And I would say the third thing is they have support for the sales professionals as well. People who handle commissions as a profession. So if someone's owed a certain commission, they get it whenever they need to get it. The tools, the right laptop, the right phone, the right software to ensure that the customer or the sales professional's productivity is as equitable and optimal as possible.
Well, you spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. You've mentioned it a couple times here. A lot of our audience also has a LinkedIn account, spends some time on it to varying degrees, of course. But what ideas, advice, tips, strategies would you have for the people navigating LinkedIn, whether they're using it a lot or maybe they're just dabbling in it?
So, LinkedIn's really interesting, and I've been on LinkedIn almost from day one. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about this recently. Its value has changed over the years. It used to be great for leads coming into you based on what you do. I would say there's three things I would recommend your audience think about from a LinkedIn perspective. One, it's the best content source. You can easily post I post something every day at 7:30, and it's usually related to one of my podcasts. Now I have so many shows that I'm posting what I call #classic Sales Game Changers podcast. And it's usually related to an event of the day or something that's happening in the news or with a company. If a company just made an acquisition, maybe I have a show with either someone from the acquired company or the acquiring company. And I always start my post with a question. What is your why? I mean, that's the most common question on LinkedIn, I guess. Or what's a sales tactic that you started doing recently that has helped you get deeper with clients that you've been trying to penetrate even further? And then I'll give some examples of what my guest talked about on the podcast. And then, I'll get a whole bunch of engagement. Typical post that I do gets between 2,000 and 5,000 impressions per show, about 100 interactions, the likes type of a thing, and usually between 30 to 50 comments, not including mine. And I always integrate. Second thing is there's about 50 people that comment on my posts almost on a daily basis. So I kind of view them as my water cooler buddies. They're my friends. I got friends from life and friends from the neighborhood and various charities, but every day I post something, they comment, they post something, I comment. So, it's kind of like, seeing my friends every day, and, they care about what I post because they see me post every day. So they know that I'm committed to sales excellence, and they all know about Lyme disease, because I post once a week on Lyme disease itself. So I've educated a couple thousand people who had no idea what the tick-borne illness of Lyme disease was. And the third thing is I prospect all the time. I Google, I LinkedIn search, I should say, VPs of sales, or, wherever. For example, I went to Sarasota a couple days ago to meet with some colleagues, and I went to LinkedIn and typed in Sarasota VP sales and found, a couple that weren't really totally appropriate for what I'm looking to do, but I use it that way. LinkedIn is always open on my computer, on my laptop, actually on my second screen. And all the time, if I see someone comment on my post, I go reply to whatever the comment might be. And you know what? Here's another thing to do. If a prospect posts something, usually if a guy or a lady is like a VP of sales, I found that they don't really understand what kind of a post gets action. So maybe they'll post a press release or a new product announcement, if I see a prospect or a customer post something, I always comment. At minimum, I like. And if they're getting 3 likes on their posts and no comments, I know that they see that I just gave a thoughtful comment. So it's a way to touch, and sales is all about getting to the next touch.
So I think we've established that you're the most unique author in the history of authors. Actually, while you were talking, I went on Wikipedia and typed that in, so now it's true. So you've written a book on sales game changers. You've written a book on Lyme disease awareness. 2 very different topics. So I have 2 questions. I'll ask the second one after you answer the first one. But the first question is, as you're writing those 2 books, because those are 2 extremely different topics, was the writing process very different for both? Or did you find that it was really just, this is how I write, so this is my process?
That's a great question. Have you written a book yet? Or are you in the process of writing a book?
Ordered both. No, I'm kidding. No, I don't have time to write a book.
Gotcha. So I always knew that I was going to write a book. And when I was in college, I was the editor of my college paper. Everybody thought I was going to be a writer. Well, 40 years later, I still hadn't written a book. So the sales book, matter of fact, right before the pandemic, I met with a consultant and we mapped out a content plan. Of all the podcasts that I've done, I've transcribed every single one from day one. And I knew that it was going to be valuable and I could use it for LinkedIn and referrals and quotes and all that. But what we decided to do was I needed to get a sales book out there. And the sales book I use it's like a marketing thing for the Institute. I get a sales book mailed to me every single day. And some of them are great. And I read them all. Some of them are great. Some of them are like, okay, good for you. 40% are, okay, I guess technically you're an author. It would have been nice to have fixed all those typos, if you will, but or I've read this 80 times before, but at least you're published and they put the work in, if you will. The sales book, since we used a lot of the content from the podcast, what we did is we came up with a list of the 30 most uttered words on the Sales Game Changers podcast. We then had an assistant go through all of our transcripts and find quotes for words like empathy and prospecting, teamwork, leadership. And then we had gathered like a humongous spreadsheet with all these examples. And then we cleaned it out. Next thing we know, we had 14 chapters on empathy and leadership and prospecting. And, it kind of flowed. The Lyme book I wrote for personal reasons, and the Lyme book just flowed. I wrote it 100% myself. I did have 50 people edit that book because it's not a treatment book, but I don't want someone to,
right.
I'm not a doctor. When people ask me for advice on how to combat their tick-borne illness, I always say I'm a history major with an MBA. Go find what's called a Lyme literate medical doctor. But no, actually the Lyme book just kind of flowed for a whole bunch of different reasons. And the sales book flowed too, but it had more of a process and a rigor to it.
No, Jamie's the author. He's written like 57 books. It's actually, I've got a whole shelf of them right here. He signed them all, so it reduced the value of every single one of them. But I've got all of them. No, I'm kidding. So question number 2, though, I think is even more important. You've written a sales book. You've written a Lyme disease book. What's the next one? Like, where do you go after those 2?
Well, it's interesting. When the sales book just made sense. And like I said, when I started transcribing the episodes, I knew that we were going to write something from them at some point. So we're actually writing the next of both. So when we gathered all the content that met for those 30 words, we had a couple people go through them and they said, Fred, you got like 10 books here. So we're actually halfway done the second book in the Insights for Sales Game Changers series, and it's on women in sales leadership. Mm-hmm. So we're telling stories of women in sales leaders and how they've overcome, how they've created something, how they got to the highest point in their career. And other women are looking for those stories. They're looking for, what can I learn? So working on the next one, we've actually even begun working on the third, which is some of the topics we hadn't covered in in the original Insights for Sales Game Changers. In the Lyme series, most of the books on Lyme disease, and there's probably been 50, I guess, they fall into three categories. Thick books, about 1.5 inches thick, written by doctors. There's a classic by Dr. Richard Horowitz, who actually wrote the foreword to my book, How Can I Get Better? And he goes through everything you need to know about Lyme. I'm probably the only person on the planet who read the book cover to cover. And there's about 6 there. Then there's the books that are about 1 inch thick, and I call those my battle with the tick books. And Stephen King writes funnier books, you know, and I don't know how much your audience knows about the disease, but it's an insidious, horrible disease that can destroy lives and families, etc. So Yolanda Hadid, who was on the Beverly Hills, or the Rich Wives of Beverly Hills, Tommy Hilfiger's daughter, Allie Hilfiger, has Lyme disease, and she wrote her book. And then there's a third category of books that are about, you know, maybe 130 pages, mindfulness and Lyme, keto diet and Lyme, herbal treatments and Lyme. So I'm the first person who's not a doctor or somebody who has Lyme, who's written a book on those particular topics. So the book was published August of 2022. I've gotten 25 suggestions on the next one. So we're noodling what that's going to be.
Well, as we wrap up here, I'd be curious, you know, just Ruston, what's some of your favorite takeaways? And Ruston, I would encourage you to write a book. You never will have enough time. You'll never, and it doesn't have to be good. You've got a shelf of Jamy Bechler books, and you know, it doesn't have to be a good book. But Ruston, your takeaways, and then we'll finish up with Fred. Just give us kind of some parting thoughts.
Well, instead of a takeaway, I did just think of one more question. I'm just curious what Fred's seeing. So we've seen, coming out of the pandemic, we've seen some massive shifts in industries. And I'm curious, from a salesperson perspective, are there certain industries that you're seeing salespeople are all gravitating to because there just seems to be a lot of opportunity and a lot of jobs available?
I mean, that's a great question. And we spent a lot of time. We've actually pivoted 3 times since the pandemic started. One of the things I'm saying, just to answer your question, which probably provides more value for what you do, there's been layoffs. There's no doubt about it. A lot of the big tech companies have had major layoffs, sometimes 10, 20%, whatever it might be. And in the tech space, I'm connected to a lot of people. I'm seeing people post, hey, I'm excited. I just started my new position at company X. And usually they're going to smaller companies, but someone who's been, let's say, at Zoom or Oracle or wherever it might be, I'm seeing them post things every day. Excited to start my new position on March 1st at blank, whatever it is. And I'll go to that company, and instead of having 80,000 employees, there's maybe 800. So there's plenty of opportunities out there in tech. If you want to stay in sales and you've been laid off, or, you know, whatever the reason might be, there's a lot of smaller companies who are looking for big company talent. And if you're willing to, it's a different type of a company. Sure. And you have to adjust. But if you're looking to move into your next thing quickly, there's a lot of those. You know, one of the reasons why we've shifted at the Institute, a lot of the sales leaders that we've spoken to, and again, we're doing today's show in March of 2023, the spring of 2023. Prior to the pandemic, professional development of their salespeople, how to make 3 more phone calls, you know, how to manage your account more effectively, how to ask the right questions. We would do half-day sessions on questions. You know, sales is really about getting to the next conversation. You know, the conversation might be to quote unquote ask for the deal, might be conversation number 30. So you got to get from 1 to 2, and then you got from 2 to 3, and then 3 to 4, and 4A, and whatever it might be. A lot of the sales leaders that we talk to, which is why we've shifted at big companies, have said they have 2 big challenges right now. And one of them isn't necessarily professional development. One of them is, how do we be right now based on all the changes of the last 3 years? People don't want to come back to the office. Customers don't want to be coming back to their office. You know, there's a lot of different rules about how you could see people now. I mean, a lot of the mask things are gone and those kinds of things. But it's like, you know, we're only going to the office Tuesday and Thursday. So, you know, if you want to go visit your customer on Wednesday, well, it's going to be over Zoom or WebEx or whatever it might be. So those types of how do we be in the sales process have changed, and customers have to adjust to it. The other big change that we've seen is companies need to support their minority demographics in sales and through the company. And for us, that's women. And there's other diverse audiences as well. One of the most impactful things is a large company who's a partner of the Institute for Excellence in Sales. And you know the name of this company. I'm not going to mention it. The AVP of sales said to me, we just lost an 8-figure deal where we were the incumbent, because the customer, incumbent meaning they already had the contract. The customer said, you don't look as diverse as we do. So we're going to go with a vendor that looks more diverse than you do, because we, as the customer, we are now serving a diverse audience. So the companies that we work with we need them to look more diverse. And they took a deep look inside and they said, well, we have a lot of women, but we're very Caucasian. So we need to think about this. As a matter of fact, the diversity, equity, and inclusion people, we spend a lot of time with. Prior to the pandemic, I never, ever talked to someone in DE&I, diversity, equity, equity, and inclusion. Now we talk to DE&I leaders on a weekly basis, and they're curious about what are we doing. Like you asked, the very first question is about women in sales. So they want to know, how are you supporting women and your minorities and diversity in sales? So those two things have risen to the top, which is why we like to say we're the center of excellence for corporate women in sales. The last thing I would say to sales professionals, that's a great question. Thank you. The last thing I would say is you got to be the value prop. You need to understand you have no value to your customer if you're not bringing them specific value on what they need right now. And it's not, hey, we'll make you more productive, or hey, we're going to make you more money. That ain't enough. You got to get deep, and there's tons of ways to do it. You just got to have that type of a mindset and mentality.
Well, we appreciate your insights, Fred. That was awesome. That's a great place to end it. Lots of takeaways. I know I will speak for Ruston on that. I know that there's a lot of takeaways that both he and I will gathered from this episode, as well as our audience. So, and if you're one of those out there in the audience that liked some of the things Fred had to say today, go ahead and kindly leave a nice little 5-star review on Apple Podcast, or smash that like button, or give it a little thumbs up on YouTube. However you can show some love. Reach out to Fred. We have his websites, contact information in the show notes. Reach out to him. Let him know how much you enjoyed this. Or maybe if you're already connected to him on LinkedIn, engage with him. Leave a comment on his posts. But we definitely appreciate all of you listening to the Success is a Choice podcast network. We will be back here next Friday at 11 a.m. Eastern time. We appreciate it. And until next time, remember that success is a choice. What choice will you make today?